Hello, everybody, and welcome to this State of APIs. We have an awesome program for you today. I've got some amazing guests with me here up on stage. But before we get started, we want to say a quick thank you to our sponsors. Today, we have This.Labs and Circle CI sponsoring us. A little bit about This. We are a web consultancy that provides architectural guidance, staff augmentation, on-demand subject matter experts, temporary CTOs, one-on-one pairing, mentorship, and open source strategy support. If you're looking for work or looking for a great consultancy to work with, reach out, talk to us. We are looking for some new opportunities to explore with others. We also have Circle CI. Circle CI is the leading continuous integration and delivery platform for software innovation at scale. With intelligent automation and delivery tools, Circle CI is used by the world's best engineering teams to radically reduce the time from idea to execution and deliver quality code with confidence. Their platform is optimized for developer productivity, speed, and confidence. The company has been recognized as an innovative leader in cloud-native continuous integration by independent research firms and industry awards like the Devies, Forbes Best Startup Employers of the Year, and Deloitte's Technology Fast 500. Ooh, that was a mouthful. But they're wonderful sponsors. We're glad to have them making it so we can do this event today. If you end up enjoying what's going on here and want to participate in future events with us, we have some other amazing upcoming events. First off is going to be Women in Tech. This month, you can join Amelia Grayson to discuss a women's work health balance. All women are welcome. We'll also be hosting Solid.js office hours. Whether you're just starting out or a Solid.js expert, come chat with us about everything Solid.js. We'll be learning about people's experiences, answering questions, sharing thoughts, and meeting other aspiring Solid.js developers. Come chat with us and Ryan Carniato, author of the Solid.js library, in this open conversation. And finally, we'll have State of DevOps. Join us for this virtual event, State of DevOps, as we bring together the experts to discuss the latest advancements, challenges, and best practices in the world of DevOps. Gain valuable insights, network with industry professionals, and stay ahead of the curve in this rapidly evolving field. My name is Dustin Goodman, and I'm going to be your host today. I've been accompanied by my amazing coworker, Tom.
Hi, everyone.
And we'll be guiding the conversation with our amazing panelists, who I'm going to give a second to introduce themselves. Handing the mic off to Uri.
Hi, everyone. I'm Uri. I'm a founder and a member of a group called The Guild. We do open source. Most people know us from the GraphQL field, like the GraphQL ecosystem. We build probably a lot of the tools that you're using if you're using GraphQL. But also recently we got into the general API world. We introduced a couple of new libraries related to Fetch and OpenAPI. And also we just recently joined the OpenAPI Foundation. We already are a member in the GraphQL Foundation, just recently to the OpenAPI Foundation. So I'm really excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Roy?
Hi, my name is Roy. Well, it says I work at StepSend doing developer relations, but we've recently been acquired by IBM. So now I'd say it's more DevRel, developer experience at IBM, where we try to, make GraphQL sort of the norm within enterprises. And also working on a lot of new sort of generative AI stuff. So hopefully we get to talk about that a bit today as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelvin. I'm a JavaScript engineer and developer advocate at Treble. At Treble, we build tools for APIs for monitoring, observability, security, and most recently, AI. So I'm glad to be here.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone, I'm Sachin. I am a member of the TRPC core team, which is like a TypeScript first way of building APIs. And I'm excited to talk TypeScript.
Amazing. I'll stop sharing and we can start the conversation.
So welcome everyone. Happy to have you all here. Thanks for the introductions and giving us some idea of what you've all been working on. I am curious,
to start things off, like what's something you're working on like right now or very recently that's really got you personally excited? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Okay, I'll go first, I guess. So what we've been working on at TRPC, mainly Alex, who is the founder, and Julius, who's like another maintainer. We've been working on a tool to detect API changes. So say you have a public endpoint, which is returning data about a user, like for their profile or whatever. And in your database, you are adding a field to the user column. Let's say it's like a passport ID. Okay, so that's like really sensitive information. You want to know where you're returning that from your API for sure. You don't want that to be public. But in TRBC, all the types are just inferred. You don't have a static schema to define. So you can easily, like inadvertently, end up returning sensitive information. So what we're working on recently is a way to detect when you're making changes to your API and sort of approve those changes. So if you've ever used Apollo's GraphOS, it's kind of similar to that, where you validate your schema changes. So every change has to be approved by, I guess, a multitude of people. And I think it's really cool because you'll be able to know, like, you'll be able to explicitly approve changes, but you don't have to define a static schema. All the types are still inferred, and you're still like working like 100% within TypeScript. And like a sort of sub-product we've been able to get out of this is you're able to like automatically validate your outputs too. So like whatever you're returning from your API, we can have it so it matches the type that TypeScript says you're returning. In GraphQL, this is just ensured by the server because they automatically like validate what you're returning based on your schema. Sorry if any of that was confusing. Feel free to ask clarifying questions.
No, that's some fun stuff, Sachin. I think I'll go next. So for me at Trouble, one of the tools we've recently released that I'm really happy about is API security. So Trouble lets you monitor REST-based API, so you get observability and monitoring. So the way Trouble is built gave us the opportunity to be able to audit every request that comes to your API for possible security vulnerabilities. So we could check for SQL injection, check for if you're using your UID versus IDs, and just I think a couple of checks. So most people, especially if you're just building APIs yourself, and it's very hard to come up with what things should I check for security. So since you already have Trouble to monitor, leveraging that to give you security coverage, like at the minimum, the basic for possible known security threats based on OWASP, it just make it really fun. So that's something I'm really excited about recently.
That's also really exciting. I'll go next, I guess. First of all, it's really cool to hear what TRPC is doing with breaking changes and everything. If you want like an Apollo, like to do your own version of Apollo Studio, you can use Hive. It's our version of Apollo Studio, and it's open source, so you can just use it. And maybe, what I don't know how you were planning to describe the schemas before and after, and making sure if there's breaking changes or not. But we would love to collaborate on it, because Hive is fully open source, so you can take it, you can build it your own, you can call it PRPC and ship it. So yeah, it would be cool to see what you're doing. Sounds really, really exciting. It also, by the way, fits like with this kind of thought that we started having around not calling we're starting to less and less think about like different APIs as GraphQL or OpenAPI or something different, but just as a scope of features that you would want from your API, and how can you get each of these features individually. As for things that we are I guess excited about, first of all, we're getting close to releasing GraphQL Mesh v1. For those who don't know that, GraphQL Mesh is a tool that takes basically any API, OpenAPI, gRPC, SOAP, you can automatically convert that into GraphQL. There were a lot of breaking changes with the years, and people So this is like people just want stability. So we're really close to getting there. If you're using it or have any feedback before we close V1, please let us know. Also, we're close to ship SOFA V1, which is the tool that does the exact opposite. It takes GraphQL APIs and exposes them as automatically as REST APIs and open APIs. I'll just say that like both of those things we're going to announce at GraphQL Conf, which is another thing that I'm really excited about. Like in September, there's going to be the official GraphQL conference. It's really interesting, really big, and I hope that everyone will join. I'll put links in the YouTube later. And last thing that I can say that I'm excited about is that we recently released FETs. FETs is both a server and a client that are completely separate, and they basically makes it very easy to create an open API server or a client that from open API we automatically infer TypeScript. So we're kind of trying to get to a similar experience like TRPC, because TRPC is like, you know, the highest bar for like ease of use, but still having the server and client separated. And we also, while doing that work, we also recently joined the Open API Foundation to help contribute there. So yeah, those are the new stuff that I'm excited about.
Nice. All very exciting. So for me, to round off this part, it's mostly AI. Of course, also GraphQL, but mostly AI. So I was speaking at a conference in Singapore 2 weeks ago, and I was speaking there around GraphQL, but I asked the audience, like, who of you is working with AI, investigating AI, and like half of all people said, we're doing something with AI. So that's mostly the thing I'm working on. If you would zoom in on the GraphQL part, I think AI is pretty good in understanding GraphQL because it's declarative, it has schemas. And if you know what a schema is, if you know what the specification is, you can probably define GraphQL queries and get data from it. Probably the same for TRPC. If you have a schema, if you know how the SDK sort of works, you would be able to have an LLM tell you how to get data from a TRPC server. So what I'm working on at the moment is making it possible to integrate all sorts of different APIs without having to actually understand the specification of those APIs. So if you would type a prompt, give me data from, I don't know, give me the current weather in this city or compare weather in a city with a different city without even knowing the APIs, but only giving away the schema to an LLM, you would be able to get all this data without needing to type GraphQL or TRPC or maybe even SQL or go to a website. So those are these sort of API integration things I'm getting excited for. So that's why I also hope the audience is investigating AI. You don't have to know what an LLM does or how it exactly works, but I do know you have to have a basic understanding on how you can use AI to your advantage.
Yeah, that sounds pretty cool. So you said you have a schema that you're using to communicate with the AI. Can you like expand on that? It sounds interesting.
No, so the basic idea is you would take an LLM. There's different ways to handle LLMs or how to sort of interact with them. I guess if you look at 90% of all the different AI tools today, they would probably force feed data as prompts into ChatGPT or some other sort of AI that exposes an API, and then sort of use that sequence of prompts to get the data you need. What I'm talking about more is like fine-tuning. So fine-tuning is where you would sort of give your own data to an LLM and train based on that data, rather than sort of follow a sequence of prompts. So if you would give an LLM knowledge around GraphQL or some other API format that has a schema, and you would also tell them about the specification, about a single schema you try to use, and then you would ask a question, a somewhat trained LLM would be able to use the combination of the schema and specification to answer your question based on the prompt.
Yeah, okay, that's very cool.
Yeah, I love this idea. I think like in GraphQL, kind of, I already heard about a number of people that are like doing it using a GraphQL schema, because it's kind of like, it's very expressive. You have a schema that expresses very well, like what the types and what can you query, but then also the query itself is very expressive. So it's actually like a question. So I think actually in GraphQL Conf, I'll try to find it and then link it. There's a couple of talks around it. I think it's very exciting. I think there's another area that I hope that like we'll get more and more solutions there, is like looking at traffic and then generating schemas from the traffic. I think maybe that's also an area where an AI could help. I know about two solutions. Like one is Akita that I think was recently acquired by Postman, and one is Optic API. I'll also try to link them. Both of them are really cool. I think what they're trying to do is like to listen to like your, what you're doing, and then trying to generate a schema out of it, which I think is extremely valuable, because most APIs out there, nobody knows what's going on there. Like when you actually go to enterprise and legacy APIs, as a consumer, like it's very, very hard. Like we found it many times to be the hardest thing. So yeah, maybe an AI could actually help there. If anyone knows about cool tools around that, like comment and let me know, because I'm hungry for more of those. It's
I think we all are. I mean, what an incredible like pivot to the type of work we've all been doing, probably in our different spaces. I think I have this question for each of you. You know, like the API game has changed dramatically over the last, I would just say, 12 months, but even more so over the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, when we think about APIs, I mean, I think there's definitely the REST train of thought. There's of course GraphQL and the RPC games coming in real hot now, especially with things like React Server Components and TRPC becoming very popular. And now with AI just changing everything, like, do we think we're going to be changing how we're doing APIs and building APIs in the next 6 months, 3 months, year or two? Kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it really depends on sort of what's your day-to-day job. If you're a web developer, you maybe incidentally write an API, maybe you write an Express server to get data from somewhere and use it in your app. I guess if you're doing that, an LLM would be able to generate part of the code that you need and help you understand all these sort of things. So I guess it really depends on how deep you are into the API game. If you're building an API for your product, because your product is maybe a SaaS service, you probably will keep writing an API yourself because you want to have some sort of control over it. But if you're interacting with APIs, I can easily see a lot of your work being replaced by code generation based on an LLM.
Yeah, I can see them being really good at querying in the future. It seems mostly like busy work, like querying, especially with GraphQL. When you have the whole schema, the AI can probably understand that really well.
Yeah, I think also like if we're talking about AI and stuff, like I think a couple of things is, I mentioned one is a hope. All of them are hopes. I don't know if it's actually going to happen, but like one thing is like I hope that this barrier between different API protocols is going to like go down, because I'm biased here because there's like we are building also tools around it, but like when you have tools that can take GraphQL and convert it into other types of APIs, or the other way around, if you have like other APIs and convert them to GraphQL or any other thing, then you can just start thinking about features. And then let's say I'm using it today when I'm going to companies, and I'm instead of telling them, hey, you should migrate your like Open API or whatever you're using for API and move to this new cool thing, or move to GraphQL, you should migrate. People don't like migrations. But if you're just telling them, hey, you can have a way to protect against breaking changes, and you don't need to migrate anything. You can just use your Open API today, convert that into GraphQL, feed that into, let's say, GraphQL Hive or Apollo Studio or anything like that. suddenly you can get GraphQL features on an API that is not GraphQL. So my hope is that like we're gradually going to remove these barriers between APIs, different APIs, protocols, different types of ways to describe a schema, because at the end of the day, it's all kind of similar. I think I don't know exactly what how you're going to implement what you said before, Sachin, about like TRPC, but my guess is like it's going to also something be very similar. It will be cool to like just to see that with TRPC suddenly maybe you can get all kinds of features that are I don't know that are GraphQL features or Open API features or stuff like that. So it's one hope that I have. The other thing is like today this is more related to the LLMs and like generative AI and stuff. If we have a lot of like those different APIs and we can ask them questions, then maybe we can stop building UIs. Like maybe we can just ask like something and then the response wouldn't be necessarily just a text. Maybe it will be a text and like a widget, like a small React widget with the data that it needs. And now suddenly there's no apps anymore. There's just like interactions with the computer, and the computer generates the UI for us. And the source for this AI would be a lot of APIs that hopefully describe yourselves as best as possible, and maybe a lot of like React component libraries or something, and then it will just fetch all of this and build the answer for you and generate like a graph or I don't know, something like that.
Interesting. Wow, that's a lot of fish on gazing. You will go, but I like it. So I'm the rest guy in this panel, I guess. But one thing I've really seen with the rise of the AI, with ChatGPT and all, is that we are going to need more reliable APIs, in the sense that people are depending on this API because like I know a ton of apps that have been sprung up just because of AI, and APIs make it possible for those apps to be built, right? So I feel we're going to need more insights and observability into APIs to make sure that is this API performing well, and like it just, we need more people to have insights to the APIs they're consuming, especially for consumers and in the AI space. And one cool thing that you said, Sachin, and I think also Roy, is this how easy it is nowadays to get from REST to GraphQL to TRBC. I'm okay with REST, but I like that you are able to move. And there's this other tool which I really like, Platformatic. I don't know if you heard about it, how you could easily make like a REST API and a GraphQL API. It's kind of fun. And I feel this barrier of entry will be so low, so you could easily just pick the API you want. So if you want to do REST for like your public API, you could still have that. You want to do GraphQL for like your mobile apps, or just like your Next and whatever you want to do, it will also be fun. And also, I feel in terms of API education with LLMs, like you said, like I mentioned, we like have this API assistant called Alfred at Treble, where you could see an API, just ask it, okay, write me the fetch code to like integrate with this API or something, and it just generates the code for you. So just like Yuriko said, we might be seeing declining clients, or it might just be an easier way for people to beat clients anyway. So that's what I think.
Yeah, I really like that idea. Making like the type of API you pick, like whether it's REST or TRBC or GraphQL, kind of more like an aesthetic choice. And like you'll still have all the tools, like all the power behind like either one. Like Yuri was saying, I think like with Hive, as long as like you can convert your API format to GraphQL, you can use it with Hive, and I think that's really cool. I think we can probably use that with TRBC, because right now we would have to build everything from scratch and like from the ground up, and it's a lot of wasted effort compared to if we were just all working on one tool. Yeah.
This brings up a question from the audience, actually. This person wanted to ask you all, when do you think we're going to go to mass solution building, where our end users can build, integrate, and build solutions, versus the current model where developers are the users building those APIs? Sounds like y'all have kind of a directional opinion of like, hey, let's just make the AI do all the work. But curious if anybody has any further thoughts on that.
I think I'm seeing like more and more like no code solutions out there. I'm definitely not an expert in that at all. But I think so. I'm just guessing here. I know that there will be a couple of talks about it on GraphQL Conf. So, but my guess is that a lot of no code solutions, they maybe the more the API is specified and static, the more you can automate and generate. So my guess is like the more, and again, it doesn't matter if it's like an open API schema or a GraphQL schema, or a JSON schema, but if you have like a strict schema of what you could get and what actions can you do, and what events you can subscribe to in your API, then it's easier to like generate stuff over it. I remember like in 2000, I think it was 2017, like we have the GraphQL code generator. It's like the famous GraphQL library. Actually, at the beginning, we've done a demo. Now it just generates TypeScript types mostly for the client and server. But when we actually started it, we did a demo where you wrote the GraphQL schema and just the GraphQL schema, which is kind of, if you just look at the GraphQL schema SDL, it's pretty like non-developer friendly. And then we generated the backend and the front end, kind of like an admin panel. Like for each type, you generated like the database, and then you generated the front end. We didn't do anything about it later. Like there's now a lot of like solutions that are trying to do that. I think GraphBase is doing something similar. But maybe also stuff like that would happen. But if you ask me the same question 6 years ago, I would say the same. And I don't know, maybe, yeah.
I think, again, it also depends a lot on what you're working on, what kind of product you're working on, what the size of your team, the size of maybe funding you have or revenue. Because I do see a lot of sort of indie hackers building multi-million companies with like low code or no code tools. So I'm guessing maybe the mass adoption already started, but we as developers are just sitting in a bubble where we like to write a lot of code. So maybe we're not seeing what sort of less technical people are doing out there. But yeah, I guess you would be kind of foolish if you would build a product or a startup and try to write all the code by yourself without using all these available solutions already. But I do hope we are sort of allowed to keep writing code a bit longer before it's been taken away and only a select few of us are allowed to write code for AI. But I guess the mass adoption already started, but it just really depends on what bubble of developers you're part of.
Yeah. I think so too. So I think of AI in two parts. And for this conversation on APIs, I really think, first of all, for large teams, it's probably just going to let them move quicker, because even with just ChatGPT, you could, give it prompts to like, okay, all right, convert this JavaScript code to like a Go code, like it just lets you move quicker. And for indie makers, all right, that want to build stuff, it's just like a very good leverage. Okay, so for large teams, it makes them move quicker. Like I'm not necessarily going to replace the developers on that team, because maybe you're building something really custom, and even though we could ask the LLM to give you a code, you might want to tweak it some more. And I believe the business context and your own knowledge still have a place, even if we can mass generate code now. I still think that for some scenarios or edge cases, performance and all those things that humans need to have input on, it's just going to help you move quicker. And for the masses, in the makers, right, it's just going to give them this, like you could literally just build anything because you can just ask the AI. Of course, you should know code to know when the AI is not giving you what you would want. So there's still going to be your own input, but it's just going to be like like I always say, an AI is just like the Jarvis to your Iron Man. Just just enables you. It's not going to replace you, I think. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's what I think too. It's going to help you move faster, not replace you.
So,
sorry.
I was just gonna say, thinking about like a low code, no code solution. If someone's starting with that, maybe not coming from a background as a developer, they're trying to get up and running with something for some vision they've got in their mind. And they're probably not going to be thinking about a lot of the things that we would think about building APIs from having done it forever. And we know all the weird edge cases and concerns that no normal person would know about or should know about. I thought it'd be interesting. Like, what are some of the struggles in building a quality API that probably aren't handled that well by a low code, no code solution, or that someone just without a strong API building background may not be aware of? And how do you all prefer to address some of those edge cases?
Okay, I could go first on this one because at Trouble, we really want you to build quality APIs, and I actually like. So I'm actually going to speak about this from the REST API perspective. I'll leave all the GraphQL folks in here to talk about that TRPC. So what we are doing, like I mentioned, is something like API security, and also we have something called the Treble API score. Like I said, we like quality APIs. So when you have trouble on your API, we're just going to tell you all the places, all the checklists that you're doing wrong. For example, if you generate like an API with like an AI tool, who might say, okay, use numeric IDs, and based on standard, we are trying to move forward to like UUID and ULIDs. We're going to tell you that you're using numeric IDs. This is prone to enumeration attacks and dedoxing and all that stuff. We're going to tell you that. But so since you're coming from like no code, low code, you wouldn't even know that because, well, they're just numbers, right? But we have all this context. So we could tell you that, okay, this one case, you need to switch to a UUID. I will tell you the reasons why. Okay, so I feel that's where I say, the insights into your API is going to be much more prevalent and important because various people are going to be building APIs now because it's so easy to do that, but they don't necessarily would know how to build a quality API. So these insights are just going to help you to cover the basis for you when you're going to fall short. Yeah.
I think that's true, but also if you're using no code, I think it's also possible for them to choose the best one for you by default. So like you wouldn't have to think about UUIDs or anything like that, really. I think the API kind of disappears with no code, to be honest.
Yeah, when building with no code, I wouldn't really bother about the API because you're basically thinking about the sort of front-end UI. If you were to build your own API, I guess the biggest mistake you could make is not using an API specification. So whether that's OpenAPI or GraphQL or TRPC. Because the biggest problem I see is people start building an API, maybe a REST API, without implementing any specification, just writing endpoints, taking in parameters, taking in path names, doing all sorts of things without structuring it in a way that is actually maintainable over time. So the biggest mistake there is not using an API specification. If I would be using a low-code or no-code tool, I would assume they use an API specification, or maybe they have their own specifications, but I wouldn't really care about it. I would only care about the end result. Is it up to my liking? Only at a point when you want to, I don't know, take this low-code solution or no-code solution and start building on top, then you would really, you would basically be in some trouble if they don't have an API specification for the API you're implementing your things on top of.
Cool. So this is all good, but what if you're offering the API as the product? With API first and all that. Like, how would you're sort of saying we're going to blindly trust the tool that is generating the API, so you have no insights as how it's performing, if it's going with industry best practices, if OWASP top 10 is being observed. I just think you probably still need insight if you're going to, because of course this is the API first economy and all that. You're going to offer API as a product. So I really think you should also check it. Just what I think.
Yeah, I mean, in that solution, you would use an API specification.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you, like, with all of you. I think we're now at the point, and now it's kind of obvious, like people talked about for many years, that now your API is your product. Like, there's more and more companies that it's not like you're shipping an app or you're shipping a website. Like, your data is exposed to third parties, and your API is your product. And even if you are shipping a web app or a product, sometimes or many times it's a different team. So basically, I think in a high level, advice would be just look at your like an advice that you would give for people that build products. Like, think about your consumers. Like, how would the experience for your consumers would be as they use your API? I think that's it's like a very basic advice, but I see so many people writing APIs that are not thinking like that. And when you're thinking about your API is your product, then first of all, you have to have good documentation. Maybe you want to add examples of how to actually use your API, and also like Kelvin said, like, you want to like you have Google Analytics for your website. You want to have kind of like a Google Analytics for your API, like who is using what are the metrics around it, maybe even a way to get feedback from your users. Like, basically just looking at like all the best practices of creating a product or an app or a website. Just this time it's your API, and we're getting, as we're advancing, we're getting more and more into a world where this is the API. Actually, this is the product. Actually, like, the API is the product. And again, hopefully, if whether it's third-party partners or the people in your company that are building the apps, or an LLM that generates answers and things, the API is the product. So
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Like, especially like with what you were saying before, with like having a database of APIs essentially, and having an AI pull from those sources. I feel like that's going to become more relevant, especially like if you've seen the ChatGPT plugins. That's sort of what they do. You can
exactly
integrate with your API.
Yeah, and like, if it's easy for a developer or a human, it will also be easier for an LLM, right? Like,
Yeah,
you have
exactly.
documentations, you have a schema, you have examples. Those are all valuable for a developer and for an API consumer and a partner, but also for open API and those plugins. This is kind of like, I guess, the future. Like, those plugins are basically just APIs, right? Like, if you have a plugin for booking.com, or like, I don't know, something like that, it's just an API for booking instead of like going through their website. So this is I think where everything is done.
I'm curious. I like this idea of the API as the product, and I think there are a few companies, notably Twitter and Reddit, who have come to the same conclusion and implemented some spicy takes on what that should mean. So I'm curious, if you've got the view that the API is your product, what does that imply for how you would want to set that up and how people would be interacting with that? It doesn't have to be in the business model sense, because that's not exactly what we're talking about today, but just like, how would you build an API with the intention that the API itself is the product and people are just plugging into the API? I'm not trying to just feed this into my own UI necessarily. I don't know how people are going to use this. I'm just building something that anyone could in theory use. How do I do that in a way that technically is sound and sustainable?
I think Kelvin probably has a lot to say, because the product that you mentioned, that you're part of, is basically doing a lot of those. I'll just say one thing about in general about maybe a more generic thing. Many people are. I have even inside the guild, we have these debates of like, if let's say you have a public API, should you use that used for partners or anything like that? Let's say if Twitter exposes their APIs and many others. Today, the most common thing is to use REST and just endpoints. And many people would say GraphQL is not for that. GraphQL is for for apps and for internal apps and everything. And we have this debate inside the guild. I'm in the position, and there's a lot of people in the guild that disagrees with me, that I think GraphQL is also actually beneficial for public APIs. And the main reason is related to your question is that because you have the queries, you actually know what your consumers are actually using. So, and that's kind of like this Google, what we said before, the Google Analytics for your API. So there's many products for that in the REST world, but inherently in GraphQL, because you can, the queries, then you can not only say like these types of users are using that endpoint and they're not using that endpoint. You can actually know which fields inside that endpoints are being used. So you can deprecate, price them differently. Like it gives you a lot of more insights into what people are actually using. Just want to.
I'm going to support that actually, because I've done that. When I was at a former gig, we did open source our API. We were doing a big migration. We were legacy REST APIs with PHP. We had some load issues because there was just so much data. We moved to GraphQL. We were able to get our internal apps load down, but two, expose that as a public API to our users, which turned into actually we learned a lot about how they were trying to use our data, how things were doing. If we wanted to price it out, we could have, but also it helped us understand where were our biggest pain points for performance in our app, and be able to start exposing that, because we were getting that type of very specific field-based feedback from the community. So I'm pro doing that. I'm with you, Uri.
Okay. Right. So like I said, I'm the REST guy, but so I'm gonna give you a real world scenario that happened to me. I was trying to play with the GitHub API. So when I got to the REST one, I sort of, because to me REST is just RPC with some standardization done, right? Because if at the end of the day, just you call in something in another computer, which is the remote procedural call anyways. So because of the knowledge of that standard, it was intuitive what endpoints to call to get what I needed. I didn't even need to look much at the GitHub API doc. But when I wanted to do the GraphQL one, I needed to go find the query and what things it needed to expose. So like I literally had to do that Google search in order to get what I needed from that stuff. So I'm not saying this GraphQL will not be a good fit. Of course, they're totally being built on it, but I feel standard just lets you move quicker, because we know if you visit /users, you're going to get all the users, right? So I think first of all, REST would be a good idea for you to build that kind of an API first product. And in terms of monetizing it, right? So you could have API keys in there, right? And some metering going on, rate limiting, and all that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, since it's your product, right, you need to also be able to monitor usage, right? Like you need to monitor usage. Is this user exposing their API keys or something? All right. Like you just need to have insights at that point, mostly for you, and also to protect your consumers of that API. All right. So you could alert them of certain, things that you might certain suspicious spike from certain places. Like, okay, this is abnormal. There's too many requests going on in here. So you could just, but you could see that. But if you don't have that in, especially if it's your product, I feel it's just like a disservice, because you wouldn't really know what certain endpoints what's happening to certain endpoints. So like Yuriko said, it's just the Google Analytics for your API. And if we're monitoring websites, now that APIs are at the backbone of almost everything, including AI on the internet, we should just double on that and just monitor that. So I'll say go with REST if it's going to be a public API. my hot take. And API keys metering, you have to meter the API to know, okay, the usage you're almost approaching your usage, and rate limiting, very important. And all these things you can get the checks if you have a good insight into that API and its usage.
I agree with you that. Sorry, you go first.
No, you go.
Okay, so I agree with you that GraphQL can be like really hard to like understand at first. Like when you're looking at a new GraphQL API, it's not very easy to discover like what to do. But I think GraphQL is the right solution if you're building a public API, because like you said, you have a lot more data to work with, like Yuri said, and that is extremely valuable. To know like what each field is doing, that information is just amazing to have, to be honest. And I think GraphQL is like the only solution that actually allows you to do that, right? But yeah, I would solve the problem with documentation instead of switching to REST. But I also see the argument for having like REST as your primary API instead of GraphQL.
Yeah, I would add to that. Like, by the way, I just looked at the travel. It looks really cool. So I think like even if let's say someone, maybe it's harder for them to create the GraphQL API, or even so in that case, like you could actually build, like you said, like build the REST API, use Travel for like all the the monitoring and the managing of it, and then for your consumers you can generate the GraphQL API from that REST API. Then first of all, it's really cool because you're actually, without too much of extra work, you're offering your consumers both ways, right? Like so the consumers actually, they might, some of them, like REST and some of them like GraphQL. If you could generate one from the other, now you could build what you prefer. Let's say you can start building like REST APIs, or maybe you have existing REST APIs, generate GraphQL and offer it to your users and see, first of all, if people are actually using and moving GraphQL or they're staying with your REST APIs. And then let's say if some of them are actually using GraphQL, then you can add GraphQL products on top of the GraphQL, together with Travel. Like let's say on Travel you get like all the the core basics and the best practices and managing of REST APIs, and then you can just add like, I don't know, let's say GraphQL Hive or Apollo Studio to have this like extra insight into what people are using. So I would say it's not this of that necessarily. Also the other way around, by the way. Like we could, let's say we build a GraphQL API, but now we have consumers that they don't care about GraphQL. They're like thinking it's a hype. It's like it's too complicated. They just want regular REST endpoints. You can do the other way around. You can use Sofa or like other tools to take the GraphQL API, generate REST API, maybe run that REST API through Travel, and see like, is the generated REST API actually conforms to all the things that Travel is doing. So I think it's there's the side of the provider, the creator, the side of the consumer. Each one of them has different opinions for whatever reason. So I guess the provider, it's very powerful if the provider can build in the technology that they want, then offer those two different API solutions without extra work, and then let the consumers choose whatever they want to consume. I think it's a powerful method.
It's fun because I actually have a project right now where I'm actively maintaining the REST to GraphQL kind of gateway, so to speak. The upstream REST API in this particular instance has poor mappings of custom fields, and they show up in these really human unusable, human unreadable versions of themselves. And so like people were passing entire large JSON files back and forth to like just translate it. And we were like, why don't we just put a GraphQL middleware in here and let's just do that translation? And so like it's a GraphQL API fully powered by an existing REST API, which is I think that's a great thing. I also like when I advising and consulting on like migrations, that's usually the path I take, but it's a good point. Like you can go the exact opposite route. It's super easy. But I think this, and I want to hear more about how TRPC could also play into the public realm. But I'm going to bring a question up from the audience that got asked a lot earlier today, and I left it for just this moment, which is there a particular standard to follow when designing schemas? And I'm going to expand the question a bit to, as you're thinking about TRPC, as you're thinking about GraphQL, as you're thinking about REST, the discoverability question is always kind of, how do I find the data I need? How do I find the operation I'm looking for? Is there a standard that, as a community using each of these different tools, we should be following to best provide our consumers of our data the best experiences possible?
Okay. I think honestly GraphQL does this really well with the the playground and everything. That makes like data really easy to find. It's all in one place. Of course, like it's still hard to find what to do, but you still see all your options in that sidebar. You can like understand what there is to do. And like Yuri said, I think you can plug that into other tools or plug other tools into that and like make a similar type of thing where you can discover all of that. Sorry, I'm looking back at the question.
I think the question here mostly is, when you design your schema, you're designing your schema for your UI, or you're designing it for the data mapping. So maybe you already have a database, so you decide to map a schema, no matter what your API specification is, based on whatever you have in your database, or are you mapping it based on whatever you want to show in your UI? Or if you're building a API as a product, you probably want to map it even more generic, like saying I want to map it based on category, or I don't know, whatever makes sense to have as an entity to map for. So I guess this really depends. It also brings me to the question then, are you designing your schema for a specific use case? So maybe you have a startup and you have a backend and you want to design a schema that works for this startup, and you don't have any plans to expand in the future, or you're building your API as a product, so you want to make it as generic as possible. So I would say there's no one way to design a schema, but it is good to think about how you want to map your data. Is it based on your database or UI or needs from users? I guess that's more like a fundamental question you should ask, and whatever one you pick, it might be also a bit more, I don't know, I guess everyone has a different opinion on what should be good. I guess it's good that there's no single way. For GraphQL, I think there's a lot of discussions going around on Twitter, like, should you map a GraphQL API one-to-one to a REST API, or one-to-one to a database? I guess that's never a good thing, because there's a reason why you already have these APIs and where you probably get sick of them and you want to use something else. But for TRPC, to my feeling, it might be a good thing, because you want to add type safety for that already existing API or database that might not be type safe on its own. So it would also depend on the use case you have.
I think I agree. I think the important thing, I don't know if there's best. I would say actually I would kind of be very careful about over designing and over architecting things, and I think that's actually where TRPC shines. I think, like, with TRPC, I think right now it's like the highest standard of, like, fast development. Like, you just write your functions. Like, if everything is TypeScript, you don't need to think about it too much. It just works, and it's like type safe. I think it's if you start something, I would actually, and you want to ship fast, and you own the whole product, I think TRPC currently is unmatched, and in terms of developer experience, and that's why it became also so popular so quick. So I think maybe you can start with that, and then just when you get to the point that you need to separate, for whatever reason, your client and your server, or you need some kind of other entity to query your API or something like that, that's only when you should think about other things. I think it's kind of, TRPC kind of like changed the game, because it showed you that you can have type safety and you can have all these things if you're just, you don't need to think about APIs when you don't need to think about APIs. It's actually, I think, easier for all of us as API creators to now have a very clear separation between, there's all the use cases of just, let's build an app, let's ship it fast, let's get it going in the most efficient way. In that case, you don't need, I think, necessarily API specifications and schemas and all of those things. Like TypeScript is just so powerful, and TypeScript inference is just became so powerful. So TRPC is so good. I think when you get to those other use cases, then yeah, you can start thinking about the other specifications. And again, there, I think for me, the type of schema that is most expressive, so means you can like describe things to the most specific details, is JSON schema. Like JSON schema is extremely powerful in like how many things you can define there. Like even like, this is a number between, it's an enum of 2, 3, and 6, or this is like only numbers between 1 and 10. Like there's so many rules there that are so expressive. On the other hand, like, so in GraphQL Mesh, for example, like every API protocol that we convert, we first convert it into JSON schema, because JSON schema is just so expressive. And in OpenAPI, the new versions, it's basically endpoints, and then how you describe the endpoints is basically JSON schema. So that's why, even though we're like very much in the GraphQL realm, and we also just, when we build Mesh, we build a lot of open source libraries related to JSON schema. We realize how powerful JSON schema is. And then we got to the OpenAPI world and to the OpenAPI Foundation. So yeah, like if you ask me, like I would want to read GraphQL schema, but I would want to, if I want to specify things, I would actually specify it in JSON schema. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, just want to go back to what you were.
Great session.
Okay, thank you. Let's go back to what you were saying about TRPC real quick. So yeah, I don't think it's necessarily exclusive with GraphQL and REST. I know there's a lot of people using TRPC with microservices. So they might have like a ton of APIs, and then they have a backend for frontend, which is TRPC. So they just pull from all those APIs, which it could be GraphQL, it could be REST. I think there's some people using with GraphQL, which is interesting. And then they have a backend that's just for their app, and using TRPC there, I think that allows you to work faster. You don't need to think about all the like things that are involved with GraphQL and designing such an API. You're just like focusing on what you need for that app.
Yeah, we by the way use the TRPC inside Hive from service to service communication. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Like I was gonna even ask you, Sachin, of what the backend for frontend story is with TRPC, because I feel at this point, like none of these tools, the GraphQL, the REST, TRPC, is going to be like, in isolation. You could just use what works, right? So for example, like if your backend want to write their REST or their GraphQL, right, in Go, and you want to give your client team the type safety, you can put in TRPC in the middle, right? And just have this backend for frontend thing going on where your client just care about the TRPC while they are having all the type safety they want. And I feel it's really good. So, but at the end of the day, I always want to stick to sort of like standard. Like I say, REST is just standardized RPC, right? So for building public, I'm going to come from like the building public facing API, like what Yurigo said, like JSON schema and Open API, they sort of like give, most often than not, you find API builders know these schemas already. So in terms of communication, it's sort of like, you just use the standard, right? So so for the convention, yeah, JSON schema or Open API for REST, and like I said, there's no this or that these days, right? Because you just use whatever you want. So if you want to like get that standard, like maybe just, you know, I feel REST place is still going to be here for a longer time than we think, because it just gives you this rest, right? Pun intended. But at the end of the day, you're stable, right? You know that this is good. Then you do your GraphQL thing or you do your TRPC thing, and it just makes it good, because at this point, both the API consumer and the API producer are kind of different already. So it doesn't really matter if they're doing REST or GraphQL, if you can always have like a backend for front end in the middle, which is what we're doing this day with things like what's this, API routes and stuff like that. It just gives you that in between, so which is cool.
So I was actually wanted to ask you a question. I think in a lot of ways you already answered it, but just I've been seeing a lot more things, like especially with React Server components in Next.js now, where things are just a lot more tightly integrated in a lot of front ends, and it's not so much direct consumption of APIs anymore. And I want to get if you have any further thoughts on sort of that trend, because we were talking earlier about how it's in a lot of ways APIs are products all on their own that can be consumed. And then you've also got this sort of opposite trend in a lot of front-end frameworks where it's like, you don't even need API. We'll just render it and send you the HTML. Don't worry about it.
Yeah. I think it depends, like what Roy would say, right? It depends on what your use case is. So for example, if I'm building a client that I know is only going to be that client that's going to consume this API, right? I don't see the need for the divide. I could just do my backend logic and send HTML down the wire like we've been doing for decades, which is what server components are actually trying to get into, which is take all that work back to the server, send back HTML, because you don't need to do all that work. All that client JavaScript don't have to run, which makes sense, right? But in the context of where API first, like things like Twilio, Stripe, they're not going to do React Server components for the API, right? They're going to still give you the JSON you need, right? Like when you could make your API calls, do your webhook thing. So it's what you're building. If your app is just going to be the sole consumer, do the TRPC, do the React Server component. That is totally fine, right? But if you're giving it to the public, yeah, REST or GraphQL can have you covered in that note. So that's just how I think about it.
Sachin, you can go next.
Okay. So I just want to talk about React Server components, I guess, for a little bit. We've been trying to see where TRPC fits into that equation, but it's very difficult right now because there's a lot of experimenting going on still with Next.js and everything. They're not even, I don't think they're out of beta yet, at least. So yeah, but I think the main idea is there's still somewhat of a place for TRPC, at least. Okay, especially like if you have a mobile app, like you still need that API for now. I don't know if there's React Native server components. I think they're working on that, but I don't think they have it right now. So yeah, if you're like using your API, if you're consuming your API in any other place than your front end like website app, you're still gonna need an API. So it kind of makes sense to just share them. Like instead of just using your database, I guess everywhere in React Native, or sorry, React Server components. It makes sense to like abstract it out a little bit so you can share it, the logic. But I think like the majority of people are just going to need React Server components. They don't need APIs. But there's still like tools that these like that we offer, like GraphQL Hive, like the Guild has, and all the tools that go with Apollo, and like Treble. You can still like observe what's happening to your API. I think that information is still important to have, to know what your users are doing.
I mean, maybe another side to this question, just to throw this one into the mix, is you go on any of the social media networks where there are developers, not to name any in particular, and you very regularly see, yeah, hey, here's an RSC example, and they have just a Prisma call directly in their front end components. And maybe a question here is that a pattern that we think we're moving towards? Is that just, hey, this is just a quick like demonstration of just how powerful this concept is? Or are we losing something by heading in that direction, and should we be afraid of heading in that direction?
I think, so I don't know, how I think about it is like, first of all, what's the actual vision of the React team when they introduced that? I think for me, there's like, if I'm looking at like the talks, the original talks that were how React was introduced, how GraphQL was introduced, and then also recently, Facebook.com got a really big design. So in 2019 to 2020, they did a talk. They had a talk about how they rebuilt Facebook.com with React, and I'll link to those talks later in the show notes. But I think the important thing is like one of the most core things around when GraphQL, let's say, was introduced, was the fact that you could specify data requirements for components, individual components, like each UI component, because until then, like everyone was using React, but then you use Flux or Redux or something like that. So you just flood all your app with data for everything. And then in each component, you will handle what's going on. And that's not how React is being used inside Facebook. Inside Facebook, they use mostly Relay. And that's the missing piece of a lot of people when it comes to GraphQL, the front-end mechanism of GraphQL, where you could, next to each component, you can write their data requirements, and the Relay compiler will automatically understand that and fetch just the data that you need. And then each component is really isolated. And I think that's the really missing part for people when they learn about GraphQL, because many reasons, but many of the, let's say, the more GraphQL experts are asking themselves why Relay is not more popular in the GraphQL world. And that's the main reason, because you need to understand like the power of writing GraphQL fragments and queries next to each component and making them individual components. Now, what Facebook is doing internally, because they rely on GraphQL, they have the benefit of having GraphQL and Relay. Once you have data requirements next to each component, now you can choose where to render each component, right? So you could maybe server-side render some components that you want to load immediately, and then some of the components you can just ship them and then later send the request. Like I don't have the visualizations here. Again, I'll link to their talk there, but now you have I think the vision, the overall vision is you have the granularity on a component basis to decide where you render the component, like on the server, on the client, or both, and where do you send the data to. So if you render the server side component, then you call the data from the server side, and then you just send the HTML. So that's like I think the holy grail of I think the React architecture, in my opinion, that each component specify their own data requirements, and according to whatever product needs, you can render it anywhere, server, client, stuff like that. I think then I think React server components, if you ask me, and I'm not sure, maybe I'm completely wrong here, but I think it's kind of started as a way for the React team to offer some of these benefits for people that are not using GraphQL. Like, how can we get basically the ability to server-side render individual components and control it on a component basis, even if you don't have GraphQL? So I think that's just kind of like, for me, it gives a better framework of understanding of where it fits, where it's not. So I'll link to these talks, because I think for me it's like it really organizes like what's going on here, why are we here, why are we doing all these things. I would say for your question, there's another thing that I would say for your question about the fact that everyone is doing Prisma on the server side, on their components. I don't think it's bad. I think there's a couple of trends here. One, Hasura is also encouraging similar patterns. And the reason here is that you can now have, let's call it edge databases. So you can now, let's say you have your database, let's say it's using Hasura or PlanetScale or whatever. Now you can actually have like replications of your database in edge, on the edge networks. So edge networks is like they're very close to the user, but they're also still protected, right? The user can't go there. So it's okay there. It's okay to send the Prisma, like an SQL request or a Prisma call or a Hasura call. So now maybe in those edges, like it goes to an architecture where at the edges you fetch from the database, and then just the leg of between the edge and the browser, you do server-side component. And that means that, let's say, the benefits of GraphQL, where you send less data over the network, is a bit less important. Yeah, like it's a bit less important, but and you can directly call your data source. I will just add one more thing to that that puts aside, this is talking about like performance and deployments and where you do it. But I will say in terms of architecture, as your app gets more complex and you have more users and more use cases, calling Prisma directly won't work. Like you would need in your components, you would need like services and you would need business logic before you call data. So I think it's very good to start, and it will actually might give you like extreme performance. But as your app becomes more complex, you have more teams and things like that, I think you would need some kind of a way to expose this data in a way that is maybe, that an SQL query directly to the data won't be sufficient. Yeah.
Roy, you got any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, I definitely agree with the fact that if you're building GraphQL and you're hoping to get all these improvements in the front end part, you definitely need Relay. I will be doing some talks this next conference season around Relay as well. But yeah, it definitely gives you more of the benefits that GraphQL has if you're looking to use GraphQL, some sort of TRPC, for things people are using TRPC for. Leaving all the backend sort of optimizations you can have at GraphQL side. But for React Server Components, I'm not really sure. It feels to me a bit like we're going back to having this MVC layer cake where you would build everything in one sort of application, which completely makes sense if you're building one application. But if you're building multiple applications, if you're building an API as a product, if you're building any product that needs to be extended, used by other people, used by different frameworks, then it will make less sense to me. So it feels to me like it's something that will really help you if you're building that one product that needs to be super fast and has the best possible developer experience for a subset of people working on it. But if you're building an API or a product for like a large group of people that needs to be extended, then I find it really hard to see the need for it. So yeah, I'm kind of curious. I mean, so far, I like most of the things the React team has been doing, and it's really pioneered a lot of the work that we're seeing in web development today. So hopefully we're all wrong and we can see benefits that we don't see today. But yeah, right now I'd say I'm mostly curious rather than optimistic it will do lots of good. But yeah,
I have one more thing to add.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I had one more thing to add. Sorry that I talked a lot about the subject because I really care about it. But I think there's one more thing. Like in GraphQL Conf, there's going to be a talk by a guy named Alec. I'll link it in the show notes. But there's like now where everyone is trying to figure out, okay, I have GraphQL, but I have Next. And there's React Server Components. What is going on? How do I fit everything together with Apollo Client and like all those things? There's a person called Alec. He created a framework called Houdini, which is basically like a new framework built from scratch, from the ground up, based on React Suspense and GraphQL. Like, what if you can ask yourself the question, what if like I would build a new Next.js, but based on the power of, I would assume the power of GraphQL, the power of Relay, and the power of all these things, and I will build these things from scratch. And he gave a demo for the guild, and it's extremely interesting. I think it's kind of like much of the reasons that people are not using Relay is because they say it's complicated. This thing took like all the cool ideas from Relay, made it way simpler, and then and they started from Svelte actually, and now they brought it to React, and it just leveraged all those like new mechanisms of React Server components that you can render everything in every way, and I highly recommend people to use it. I'm really excited about this thing. I think this thing could change a lot in how people perceive even the current landscape of GraphQL clients, like Apollo client, Urkel, and Relay. Like, I think this would kind of like shake things up, and also even like shake things up in terms of like Next.js. I think like, and Remix and stuff. I think it's a very interesting take. So I link to his upcoming talk in GraphQL Conf. Yeah, that's one point that I want to.
Okay, so I've got a question. I was thinking a few weeks back, Twitter was having some problems where people were getting rate limited. Whether or not that is actually what was happening, that's a different question. But it certainly introduced the idea to a broader amount of the public. And it sort of got me thinking, if you're building an API, you've probably got to have some amount of rate limiting in mind. How do you design rate limiting in a sane way, and how does that differ across the types of APIs that we've been discussing? Roy, could you chime in with that one?
Well, it gets to depend, right? I mean, if you look at a product like Twitter, it would also become a discussion around pricing and how do you want to make people jump into the next tier of your pricing. So I'd say that's one way to do rate limiting. So it's either evolving around pricing. If you have a free product, if you have something that you want to be available to everyone, your rate limiting is probably centered around costs. Like, what can you do without making it too expensive for you to run the amount of queries or requests someone likes to ask. So the two things I would consider is either costs or pricing, leaving aside that you try to build a scalable system, because if you don't build a scalable system, maybe a third point to take into the equation would be how scalable a system is before you run into any issues. If you look at rate limiting for example, REST versus GraphQL, I think Twitter is like I think GitHub is like a good example. They have both the REST API and the GitHub and the GraphQL API, and rate limiting is different for both. I think for GraphQL you can do way less requests per minute than you can do for the REST API. So there it's mostly a consideration, probably around costs or maybe around scalability. Either how much queries do you want someone to send within a different time period, or how deeply do you want them to nest it? So yeah, for me, it's 3 points. It's either pricing, costs, or scalability of your system.
Okay. So I think in terms of rate limiting, like GraphQL versus REST, I think in GraphQL, it's a lot more complex. Literally, it's called I think it's GraphQL complexity plugin. Lets you like kind of rate limit your queries. So I think it's kind of way more complex than REST, but you're trading that complexity for kind of like a fine-grained rate limiter. Like you can limit access to individual fields, individual like data types, I guess. And it's very like accurate. Compared to REST, you're kind of just like outputting a huge amount of data, you don't really have a lot of control over like what exactly is being outputted. Like you're just like giving them everything. So that kind of makes it hard to rate limit, but it's a lot easier to just like put a number on that and say it's going to cost us this much. Yeah, I think it's kind of a trade-off.
Yeah, I think if you boil it down to specifics, you probably need some sort of API gateway for your API, whether that's REST or GraphQL, where you can define either like pricing, costs, or scalability to figure it out. So for GraphQL, you have this cost calculator indeed. One of the things I actually noticed when joining IBM, the IBM API gateway has some sort of way to define the cost for a GraphQL query right in the API gateway. And I think there's more gateway solutions that can make it easier for GraphQL to figure out how expensive a query might be. So that will be either cost or scalability, because you want to make sure that whenever a query is run, it doesn't, either lead to some sort of hiccup in your system, or might be too expensive if you have all these edge databases doing functions where you would pay for every function or every time someone retrieves data.
So the way I think about rate limiting, like I think Roy mentioned it, is why are you rate limiting in the first place? And that also would tell the kind of rate limiting you do. And of course, I'm speaking from REST. You want to rate limit either by session or by IP, depend on why you're rate limiting. Okay, so maybe if it's for the case of monetization, definitely session, because if it's IP, are definitely just to use a VPN, or something, right? So you need to understand that. And one thing I've learned from REST is that there are sort of standards you can stick to. I think before now, there's this X rate limit stuff going on, X rate limit remaining and all that headers. But I think it's been standardized to just be rate limit. And I think there's a body that actually governs that kind of standard that's actually put that in place. So you need to know if you're supporting the right standards. So yeah, so your clients or anything you're building can actually rely on that. So you know your headers, of course, maybe your backend will take care of that, your rest, but I'll probably for now, like I still see APIs still using the X headers, even though there's a new standard. So I think that's what it to also check for. And of course, if you are rate limiting for like maybe for security or for fairness or maybe for like stability, like you don't want DDoSing or overload to one particular user just bringing in all the requests. So that will determine if you're going to do via session or by IP for rate limiting. Yeah.
I just want to add about GraphQL that I agree that with GraphQL, because the client can send queries, rate limiting and cost calculation can be more advanced and maybe more I would say maybe hard for people, but I would say in 99% of the cases, if you are in that position, you're doing it wrong, because the how you should use GraphQL is that GraphQL, your endpoint, should be open to queries just in development, because you should use persistent queries. Persistent queries are the simplest and most powerful way to protect your GraphQL APIs, because if you control all the clients that query your API, what you can do is just run a build that understands all the queries that are actually coming from your own clients, and then just filter just for these queries. And you basically turn them into basically a kind of a REST endpoint. So at that point, it's not open anymore for everyone to query whatever they want. It's only open to queries that you know in advance. And most large-scale GraphQL APIs are doing that. Like Facebook is doing persistent queries. They're not. It's built into Relay. It's like you're not actually exposing a public GraphQL API. So I just wanted to mention that, for most people that are using GraphQL, I don't know why, but you should use, like, why more people are doing it, but you should use persistent queries, then forget about all of those things, because then it's basically like REST APIs, like Kelvin said. Like, then you could use even REST API tools for rate limiting and stuff for GraphQL. Like, it shouldn't be more hard than that. But let's say in the very, very small case that you do have a public API, or you're not using GraphQL and you're not using persistent queries, I think Sachin mentioned like the complexity plugin. So there's like a library called GraphQL Armor. It was built by the Escape people. I'll also link it. It's kind of like an all-in-one security package for your GraphQL APIs, and you can use it with GraphQL Yoga or Apollo Server. And it has like configurations about what queries to allow and how. And the cool thing that we build into that is that we connected it. Actually, it's a possibility to connect this GraphQL Armor to Hive. So Hive knows it's like your analytics to your GraphQL API. So based on these analytics of the things that's actually happening in production, you can take these numbers and feed those into your GraphQL Armor to protect against the things that you know that are happening, like to let the things that you know that are happening in production to go pass through it, and everything above it, let's say, to block and limit. So, but again, this is a very nice setup, but most likely that you don't need it. Like, most likely you can just like use persistent queries and be done with it.
Yeah, persistent queries make a lot of sense. I've never heard of that though. But that sounds very good. And I think this is kind of where like the observability would come into play. Like, you would have that information to rate limit your API.
Persistent queries are great. Speaking from experience, we used it a ton. The public API I mentioned earlier, that was one of the ways we fixed some of our app performance. Oh no, we lost Sachin. But hopefully he'll be right back, because I'm going to ask one final question because we're on time. So, oh, perfect. He's back just in time. All right. So we're going to just do a quick 30-second response to this. No more than that. Around the room. We've talked a lot about APIs today. We've heard about TRPC. We've talked a lot about GraphQL. We've talked a lot about REST. Have any of you converted your ideology and are going to change what you're doing tomorrow? Or are we all just going to be building LLMs starting this afternoon?
I think I really like what Yuri was saying about, like, you can kind of make a common format for all these tools and like work on just like one tool. Like, I can connect TRPC to Hive and we can just use that. I think I would look into that and see how we can collaborate on similar tools, so we don't have to just build our own from scratch.
Yeah, so for me, like I said before, because of the way the tools can talk together, I'm still going to always have REST for my basics. Sorry, I like REST. I'm old and boring. But if I want the GraphQL, there's a lot of tools to let me have GraphQL get the data it needs for my REST API, or even straight to my database. So I could definitely use the tools, the right tool for the job. For public API, is always going to be REST for me, because I feel it's more standard. If it's just for like a client thing, I'm definitely going to try a GraphQL or TRPC. Yeah.
You're not old and boring. That's a fun answer.
I think some things that I think is, first of all, I think that like I said before, I think that I would use, I'm currently using all the tools that are mentioned here. Like, and I think it's because two things. Like, one, there will always be new things. Like, it feels like what can you invent in API world anymore? But then suddenly TRPC came in and was like, exploded in the scene and showed us like that there's so many things that we have no idea about, and we can do so much better. So I'm sure those new things will keep coming. And on the other hand, I think everyone here that's been in tech for long enough knows that like tech is not going away. Like, SOAP is still here. Mainframes are still here. COBOL are still here. So, and all of those things are still growing, which is crazy. So I think any tech that that it comes out there, any infrastructure will always grow. There will be new shiny things, but and REST is, now that we're also part of the Open API Foundation, like REST is like continuously improving, continuously getting more advanced. And there's so many specs also in REST. Like we didn't mention OData. OData is kind of like a weird version of GraphQL in REST. Like OData is basically you can send queries over REST. So yeah, hopefully soon, like LLMs will just understand it all and will generate apps for us from the APIs. That's the hopefully
Love it.
The future.
Roy, take us home.
Yeah, like everyone said here, I'm just hoping people will continue using API specifications for the APIs, and then either developers like us can build cool tools to connect all the dots together, or find ways to maybe even make a better API specification, and then we can use all of this to build one large LLM that just does all of this for us. But now I'm super hyped for the future with all these things, and whether you're building AI applications with GraphQL, TRPC, or REST or OpenAPI, I think we'll always have a job, as we showed today. And yeah, just super hyped for the future, and super hyped to have a group like this together that we can learn and explain, and hopefully lots of people have tuned in and learned more about all these different technologies.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Well, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Kelvin, Sachin, Uri, Roy. It's always amazing talking to each of you, and I'm glad y'all were able to make it today. If you enjoyed this one, join us for the next one, and have an amazing rest of your Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.